If a person is 16, overweight by 20 pounds, and tends to resemble a Neanderthal cave woman, there are days she wishes she had never been born. Every time I forced myself to look in a mirror, I groaned involuntarily at the sight and turned away with a sigh of despair. It seemed nothing short of a miracle could make me a member of the human race. Still, one day something did occur that changed me very quickly. In the space of a month, I had my hair cut short into a decent style, lost almost all the bulges I didn't need, and could once more dare to go in a bathing suit to a public beach. I have never known whether to be grateful for this or to be sad over the way it had to happen. Most of the time, I forced myself to laugh. It was really my English teacher who started the whole thing. Mr. Waters was the type of man girls dream of marrying someday. I was fat and ugly, but there was no law against dreaming. He was tall, with just a slight stoop that made him look a little tired. He had strong hands and a thin face with deep creases in his cheeks, as if he had grown weary of so much knowledge of the world, and his manner of teaching was gentle and patient. He never ridiculed anybody in class, even if they asked the stupidest questions, and he always gave me straight A's on my work. "You know, Betty Jane," he said to me one day after class when I had lingered a while to ask him some questions, "you have a good, clear, logical mind, and you speak well. Why don't you take up debating?" "You mean, try to get on the team?" I responded. "I'm sure you can get on with my recommendation. What I mean is, do you want something badly enough to throw everything into the fight?" "Well, sure, I guess so." I was not too enthusiastic. I was really very shy, hating to answer even a question in class, and the thought of getting up in front of a large crowd of people made my blood slow down to an icy crawl. But I adored Mr. Waters, and if there was anything he wanted me to do, like throwing myself off a cliff or pushing a peanut down Main Street with my nose, I think I would have done it. And if he thought I would make a good debater, then I would try or die. Usually I lumbered home from school like a weary elephant, but that night I fairly flew. "Mother, guess what?" I burst in on her in the kitchen. She was making cinnamon nut rolls, my favorite food. She always made an extra dozen just for me. "I've been asked to go out for debating." "They want you on the team?" She looked up, smiling. She was always very pleased when I did anything social, and any little school triumph made her feel good. There were times when I forced myself to do things just for her sake. She had been very popular when she was young, but I know she never realized what it cost me to go to a school dance without a date and spend the eternal night sitting against the wall. I could almost see a sign hanging over my head: "Wallflower." Why, oh why, is it that good-looking mothers so often have homely, spurned daughters? Is it the law of diminishing returns? Well, I've always tried to be honest with myself. The team didn't ask me, but Mr. Waters did, and he's their advisor, so I guess what he says goes. I wanted her to finish the rolls, could hardly wait for them to come out of the oven. Casting a look over my shoulder at them, I went up to my room to change clothes, and this was one of the times I dared to look in the mirror. Oh, I'd glance in it to comb my hair or scrub my teeth, but just because you look at something doesn't mean you see it. I never really saw myself in the mirror except when I forced myself to look. I hadn't changed since the last time I'd looked, about 4 months ago. Oh well, I thought, the cinnamon rolls will be done in a few minutes. Mr. Waters didn't say anything to me for a few days. Then, on a Wednesday after my last class, as I was going out the door, he called me back. "Betty Jane, if you want to be on the debating team, we could use you." This time, I was ready for him. I'd had several good, long talks with myself. You can't stay wrapped up in yourself like a moth in a cocoon all your life. It isn't enough just to get a few good grades on a report card. You've got to get out there and do something. Be somebody. Even to myself, I sounded like a losing team's cheering squad. "All right, Mr. Waters, I think I would like to." Here I stumbled and couldn't remember what I wanted to say, but Mr. Waters just smiled and said, "Fine, I thought you would." So I worked hard and threw myself into debating with all the enthusiasm I had. I wanted mostly to impress poor Mr. Waters. If he had ever had a glimpse of the daydreams I used to indulge in featuring him as Prince Charming, he'd have run so fast we'd never have seen him again in our school. "That was very good, BJ," he said after my third practice. "Keep it up and we'll have a chance to win the county league meet." I was thrilled that Mr. Waters knew my nickname. Only a couple of the girls at school used it. I had never really liked it till he said it. This debating team exercise bolstered my self-confidence as nothing had ever been able to before. For the first time in my life, I began to forget my sad physical traits. Not always, of course, but with Mr. Waters sitting calmly in the back of the room, I could launch into the ideas it took to make my points. Needless to say, my mother approved heartily. I had only to tell her that I had spoken to John so-and-so, and she would beam like a full moon and say, "See, dear, I've always told you so." But what she had always told me was not exactly the way things were with me. She often said things like, always let a boy know you are more interested in him than in yourself, and be a good listener and everything else takes care of itself, and if you want to be popular, you can't let the boys know you have any brains. This was fine and dandy for my mother. It might have worked for me if I had been like her. My trouble was I didn't have the good looks she had been born with, nor her pleasant, easygoing ways. What I did have was just what she was always telling me to ignore, a fairly decent brain. It was my only real asset, and if I wasn't supposed to make use of it, what was I to do? The winter months passed. Butterflies became permanent tenants in my stomach as the time drew closer for mounting the platform in public. The last 10 days I went around in a sleepwalker's daze. The interschool meet was going to be held at Rigby, only 20 miles away. This was bad. It was just close enough to allow my family to drive down. I'd have preferred going alone to my judgment. The day arrived. My mother had bought me a new dress, a blue print with tiny flowers sprinkled all over it. Unhappily, through anxiety, I'd been eating even more than usual and had put on an extra 8 pounds. I couldn't even get the dress down over my hips, so I had to wear an old black thing that hung on me like a wrinkled tent. My folks drove me over. It was like going to my own execution. Mr. Waters said, "BJ, how's my champion debater? In good form, I trust?" I squeaked, "If you mean ready to drop dead of fright, that's me." "Oh, come now, it isn't all that scary, is it?" He put his hand out and patted my arm. I threw my shoulders back and forced myself to smile and decided that whatever was going to happen, I'd do my best not to let Mr. Waters down. In a daze, I took my seat on the stage, the center of attention, I thought, one girl outnumbered by 9 boys. I half listened to what the others were saying. I could hear the burst of applause after each contestant, and I knew that down there in the darkness were people who knew and cared for me. Why was I so shaken? I sat there in front of everyone, a smoldering fire within myself, yet outside I was simply a plain, overweight girl in a frumpy black dress, who looked as if she should have been attending somebody's funeral. Then, the next debater was announced, my opponent. And how am I to explain what happened next? It was like a bolt of lightning, sunlight, shining down into a darkened well, like the unheard promise of eternal spring. It was, well, in short, I fell in love. My opponent was the boy I had always dreamed of. He was tall, he was slim, he was lovely. I could only stare at him open-mouthed and unattractive. He stepped up to the rostrum to state his views on the subject, resolved that women's rights should be curtailed. And I must say he had some clear and strong views on why women were already overextended, why their place was in the home, and why they should not compete with men any more than they already were doing. I had not heard his name when he was introduced, but I didn't need to know his name. It was enough to be up there on the stage with him. Then it struck me. This boy with whom I was hopelessly enchanted was supposed to be my opponent. I was expected to leave my seat, march over to the very spot where he had been standing, take up the same position and the same question, and proceed to undermine and defeat him. And had it been anybody else in the world, I could have done this with no qualms. But fate had chosen to throw me into conflict with this boy at the same moment I was plunged into love with him. I knew that it was my right to rise and refute him so I would win the contest and the gold medal. But I had to ask myself, did I want to defeat this boy? And if I did, would I ever have a second chance to see him again? Would he take it with good nature, or would he hate me? Would he respect my intelligence if I won, or would he despise me? What if I deliberately threw my chances of victory away? I didn't know. I couldn't decide what to do. Finally, he was through with his speech. His arguments, while good and valid, would not, I knew, hold up to mine. I made no conscious choice. I merely rose, walked to the speaker's rostrum, and gripped both edges to keep from fainting. Then, being true to something in myself, I started speaking. Quietly, calmly, point by point, I demolished his arguments. In the back of my mind was a strong, burning thought. He will respect me if I show him exactly what I am, not what I pretend to be. If I could win his respect, things would be all right after all. I threw myself into my speech. I held back nothing. I devastated his arguments. And I won. Afterward, there was a crash of applause that sounded in my ears like the pounding of surf upon the shore. I had to rise from my chair as the gold medals were awarded. I walked to the center of the stage and received the little box symbol in my hand. I didn't want it. It meant nothing to me. What I wanted was to walk across to where the boy sat looking down at his shiny shoes, to hand the medal to him and say, "Here, you take it." But of course I couldn't do that. He and his team were the defeated. He had to face his family and his friends, beaten by a girl. All that either of us wanted was to get away. That was what I needed, and from the look on his face and the sympathy I had for him, I was sure he felt the same. We didn't speak. It was the custom for the defeated team to congratulate the winners, but he didn't. I couldn't blame him. I knew it would hurt too much. So we left. My family and Mr. Waters and the boys on the team were all feeling good. They laughed and joked and enjoyed themselves, but I could only sit quietly and think. From the program I grabbed as we were leaving, I read his name. John Weatherby. What a beautiful name. I said it over and over in my heart. For the next few days, I did nothing. I accepted the polite friendliness the teachers accorded me and found that overnight I had become somebody in the school. I became BJ to a good many more kids than had ever bothered to speak to me before. But none of this was what I really wanted. All I could think of was John Weatherby, and I wanted him to think of me, but not in the way I knew he was thinking. So I did something I should never have done. I wrote him a letter. It was a crazy thing to do, and looking back on it, I wonder what could have been in my mind at the time. Dear John Weatherby, I wrote, I don't really know how to say this, but I wish it had been you who won the contest last week. I really think you deserved it. Did I really? Perhaps we can meet again under more friendly terms. Was I fishing for a date? Sincerely, B.J. Barton. I carefully wrote in my address at the bottom and again at the top. John Weatherby didn't answer, but I thought he would in time. I watched and waited for the mailman every day. I quit eating almost entirely, and to escape from my mother's eternal solicitude, I took long walks, making a special point to be absent at regular mealtimes. During these walks, I had solitary debates within myself. When I went home, I would go directly to my room and work through a routine of strenuous exercises. Within a month, I had lost most of my extra weight, and I was still waiting for the mailman. Hope was dying in me a little each day, but I was going to give him plenty of time before I gave up. Neither my mother nor anyone else knew what had come over me. Just leave me alone, I kept saying. I'm perfectly all right. But of course I wasn't. I was sick, not only lovesick, but sick with despair. I wished I had never heard of the contest. I wish I had jumped off a bridge before letting myself get roped into such a deal. I even lost most of my feeling for Mr. Waters and began looking at him with a jaundiced eye for being the original cause of my trouble. And still I waited for the mailman. One day I made an appointment at a beauty parlor. Usually if my mother tried to make an appointment for me in her program to make me a human being, I would manage to avoid it. This time I went and I had my hair cut the same as the other girls in school. People who hadn't seen me lately didn't know me when they met me on the street. I'd had a complete metamorphosis from an energetic, ugly caterpillar to a butterfly. Was I going to be rejected after all that effort? When 6 weeks had passed and still no answer had come, I decided, against my common sense, that the letter had gone astray. If it had never reached him, how could he answer? So I made my next mistake. I wrote another letter. Dear John Weatherby, I wrote, perhaps you don't remember me, B.J. Barton from the Rigby contest. I just wanted to know, what did I want to know? How things were with you these days. I'm still slaving away in school, and I know you are too. Will you go out for debating next year? I'm not sure that I will, but perhaps we will meet again under some other conditions. Sincerely, B.J. Barton. I wondered if I should enclose a picture of my new self, but I didn't. Again, I wrote my address on top and at bottom. This time I received an answer within 3 days. Dear Miss Barton, would you please stop writing me letters, rubbing in the fact that you won the debate? I am quite aware of this, and I'm sure it pleased you very much. It would also please me very much if you would drop the whole thing right now and use your laurels to compensate you for other things. Sincerely, John Weatherby. There it was, my long-awaited letter from my love. After all, what had I been expecting him to write? Something like, Dear BJ, I love you? Surely not. Yet I had expected something more from him. In my mind, I had made up a person who did not exist. He was never to be anything more to me than a sad and forlorn memory, while I suppose to him, if he ever bothered to think about me at all, I was that horrible fat girl in a frumpy black dress who went out of her way to beat him in the Rigby contest. Thus I learned a lesson early in life, a hard lesson that I might have lived without, one I went out of my way to ask for. I know now that other people are not always what we think they are, and also that we are not necessarily what other people see. So perhaps it was not a complete loss. I think about John Weatherby once in a while, not without bitterness and sorrow and an inner ache where my real self lives, but I'm very grateful to John Weatherby too. I never became fat again. I lost my pathological self-consciousness and learned to live in the world of other people, to be aware of their needs and feelings as well as my own. And whenever I am inclined to get a little smug or self-satisfied or complacent, I drag out that little gold medal from the bottom of the closet and stare at it and think of what it cost me.